Welcome to the Covered Bridges of New Hampshire podcast, where we discuss all things related to covered bridges in the Granite State. Here's your host, Kim Chandler.
Hello, Covered Bridge people, and welcome to the podcast. This episode features an interview with Craig Pursley, who I met while doing my research on the Bath Covered Bridge. Craig is an artist who lives and works near the bridge and serves as a docent of sorts of the second oldest covered bridge in the state. I really enjoyed talking with him, and I know you will too. Here we go. In this episode, we're talking about the Bath Bridge that was built across the Ammonoosuc River in 1832. The Bath Bridge is one of the second oldest covered bridges in the state. The Thompson Bridge in Swansea was built in the same year. The bridge is located in Bath Village near the Brick Store, one of the country's oldest continuously operating general stores, and is also near the American Heritage Gallery of Art, owned and operated by artist Craig Pursley. Today we're talking with Craig, who I had the pleasure of meeting while doing my research on the Bath Bridge. First, let's hear a little bit about Craig. Craig started early in art, obtaining professional commissions at 14 years old, and was chosen as Nebraska's outstanding young artist at 17. While in college, he worked as a composite artist for several law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, and continued doing so after becoming an art teacher in Colorado. After a move to California, he began work as an illustrator for a major newspaper, and during this time, he also achieved considerable notoriety as a sports artist for the California Angels, Topps Baseball Card Company, and Upper Deck Baseball Card Company. In 2002, Craig and his wife, Julie, moved to New Hampshire, where he paints the beauty of New England. His work has been featured in American Art Collector, Southwest Art, and International Artist magazines, and can be seen in the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library and Museum, the National Baseball Hall of Fame, the St. Gaudens National Historic Site, and in private collections from coast to coast and in Europe. He has won many national awards, including 2 Best of Shows in 2015. He was chosen by New Hampshire Magazine as Best White Mountain Artist and has 2 portraits on permanent display in the State House in Concord. This past July, his artwork made the cover of International Artist magazines. Welcome to the podcast, Craig.
Thank you, Kim. I appreciate it. Good
Great.
to be here.
Thanks. So let's talk a little bit about you. So how did you get to the little town of Bath from the Midwest?
I have my wife to thank for that. She was raised part of her childhood in Massachusetts. And at the time we were living in California, and she wanted me to see New England in the fall. So she booked us on a fall foliage bus tour in 1993. And so we came out, and the bus stopped in front of the Brick Store, which is, as you mentioned, the oldest continuously run general store in America. And right behind it is the Covered Bridge. So there's a lot of tour buses that have stopped there over the years. And we unloaded, walked across the bridge, and as I was taking pictures of the bridge, she said, "Hey, there's a for sale sign on a house down here. Let's go take a look." So I cringed because I hate moving more than anything in the world, but walked down about 100 yards and stood in front of this neat old house. And as we looked out across the river valley, which was the best foliage in 20 years, according to the locals, and the beautiful time of day, it was just, it couldn't have been more perfect. And she said, "I want to live here." We didn't have time to look or knock on the door or anything. And we really couldn't do anything about it anyway. We had 2 kids in school in California, and there were about a dozen reasons we couldn't. But we loved that tour so much, we took another one 5 years later. So in 98, we're back in Bath, New Hampshire. And we remembered as we drove in, this is the town we love so much. And I thought, well, maybe with the changes in technology, maybe we could keep our California jobs and do them from here. And that same house was still for sale. It had been rented out the whole time, but was still available and had gotten a lot cheaper. And it got a lot cheaper because of the condition was pretty bad. But it was just 100 yards from the Covered Bridge, and that made it real attractive to me. And so one thing led to another. Everything worked out, and we were able to get the house. And now we can sit on the porch and look out at the Covered Bridge, or roll over in bed in the morning and look out the window, and that's what we see is that Covered Bridge from 1832. So it was definitely a draw, that bridge, for sure.
That's amazing how one random trip can change your whole life.
Yeah, really did.
Absolutely. Well, and during the fall foliage, there was no better time to be here.
Yep. Yep.
If you'd come during mud season, that might have been a different
That's
conversation.
right. Actually, after that second time when we thought about buying it, we thought, well, let's see it at its worst. So we came back by ourselves in February, and we still loved it. So even though it was 12 degrees, but
That's amazing. That's great.
still wanted to do it.
Good. Good. Well, I am glad that you did. So when I met you last summer, I was about a year into my research for this book, and what the pattern had become was I'd reach out to organizations, and someone would get back to me and say, "Well, come into our space. Sometimes it's an office, sometimes it's a closet, and you can dig through the records and you find whatever you want to find." But when I reached out to you, your response was very different. And this is what you said when I asked you if you had any archives. You said, "Archival, no. What I have are a laundry list of amazing stories on the bridge, which most find very interesting. I would be happy to walk you through the bridge and tell you all the tales." I was so excited.
Really?
It was the best response ever. Yeah. And I feel like,
I didn't know that it would have stood out from any of the others.
oh, it was the only one like it.
I'm sorry, there's a little hitch
Yeah.
there in the video. It hangs up every once in a
No,
while.
your response was the only one like it. And I was so excited because, when you go to a covered bridge, it has stories to tell, but there's there's nobody there to walk you through it. And so I felt really lucky that you offered that to me. And so I
Thank
guess,
you.
yeah. And you've
Glad to do it.
you've become sort of a docent for the Bath Bridge. And I wonder, how did that come about?
Well, we were able to get the art gallery. There's only 3 businesses on the town common: the general store, an ice cream shop, and what was an antique store. And the lady that ran the antique store was really old. And I thought maybe in a few years, when she's ready to quit, that could be an art gallery. And with the tourists that come, that would be terrific. So I wanted to do that. And since we live on one side and work on the other, I would go through it every day, at least twice, and usually walk and the initials that have been carved in for all those years and the wear and tear and stuff. And it became something really close to me. And I'm a big fan of history anyway. So I read the town history. There's actually kind of 2 town histories. Read those repeatedly. And for some reason, those stories that were in there and stories that I heard from other people just really stuck with me. And I realized at some point that even the others in the Historical Society, I think most would know the date that it was made because it's on both ends. But not much else. And surprisingly, I don't think a lot of them read the town history either. So I kind of became, by default, the people. In fact, you were probably directed to me from somebody on the Historical Society.
I was.
Which, that happens. It's not too infrequently that, if you want to know about the bridge, go talk to Craig. Which, and I'm fine doing that. There's times that I've just walked through the bridge and somebody, if they hesitate too long, I'll say, "Do you want to hear the story?" And I'll tell them the whole thing. So I enjoy it.
That's wonderful. I was actually referred to you, but you were away for the winter or part of the winter.
Oh,
and
right.
So I reached out to that person again, and the response was, "Well, let me drive by and see if the open sign is flying at the gallery." And then he wrote back and said, "Yes, it is." So that's how I found you.
Yeah.
So speaking about these stories, I mean, I was fortunate enough to have one of these tours. And the stories and the legends that you told me, I wrote about in the book. So I don't want to give them all away. Hopefully somebody will purchase the book and read them. But I really love the stories about the windows. And I was wondering if you could share those.
Sure. It's a story that makes a lot of people cringe. And there's kind of 2 with the windows. The bars, there are bars on the windows on the upstream side and not on the downstream side. And people often ask, why aren't there bars on both sides or neither? And the reason is, at least the reason I was given, is that years ago they used to have a street dance on the common right in front of the brick store. And during the course of that, some people would get pretty inebriated, and sometimes they would jump out the windows of the bridge. And the upstream side, you have no idea unless you live there that there's a waterfall just on the other side. So they put bars there to prevent that, and apparently chose not to on the downstream side, because if you're dumb enough to look out and see the waterfall and jump anyway, you're on your own. And the other story was that as recently as the 1970s, people here in Bath would drive partway into the bridge, put their car in park, pull out their trash, and throw it out one window on the downstream side. And one window was kind of the designated trash window. And that's because right below that window, almost all the time, there's a big granite outcropping. But if it rains 2 or 3 days, then the level of the river comes up and it flushes all of that downstream. And about 4 miles later, it's in the Connecticut River and eventually would go to the ocean. And they think, at least I think, they felt that that was better than throwing their trash out any random window where there would be junk floating down the river all the time. This way, it would just happen after a big storm. But at one point, there was a guy doing repairs on the metal roof up on top who slipped and fell, and it's a long fall. But he landed in so much trash that he was unhurt. But that fall would kill him today. There's no question.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. Was there an ordinance passed about stop throwing your trash out the bridge window, or did people just stop?
I don't know that. I would hope people would have come to their senses on their own, but sometimes they have to be led to. I don't know.
Wow. Well, that man was lucky, I suppose, to have the trash to fall into.
Yeah, lucky he was working then and not now.
Right. Well, now with OSHA, he would probably be harnessed to something.
I'm sure that's true. Yeah.
Well, maybe. So in many of the covered bridges, you can still see remnants of the old handbills and advertising from the 19th century. And the Bath Bridge has a very unique advertising campaign that's still visible from 1860. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, and to be honest, I could only see part of that until they did the repairs that were finished in 2014 on 2 of the arches on the western side. There was something hand painted there, and during those repairs, they removed the wainscoting that went the length of the bridge on both sides. Once they took that down, and they never replaced it, then you could read the whole thing, and it says ST 1860 X Plantation Bitters. The ST stands for started trade, so they started trade in 1860. Nobody seems to know what the X stood for, but Plantation Bitters was a cure-all that was made somewhere in the vicinity that would cure hair loss and upset stomach and diarrhea or anything that was wrong with you, supposedly. But you have to keep in mind this was at a point in history of the country where there was a significant temperance movement. And so if you walked into a tavern here and ordered some ale or something, people might talk. But if you went into the store and got some Plantation Bitters, which had 38% alcohol, people would just say, "Oh, he's not feeling well." So, so those signs still appear on both of those arches, hand painted in big letters from, I assume, around 1860.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So you talked about a little bit, you alluded to the work that was done in 2014, but by 2005, the bridge was in need of some work, and the town began looking into funding a project, which was about $2.9 million. And it took 4 years for the funding to be garnered and another 3 years for the work to start. So what condition was the bridge like during those years that it sat waiting?
To be honest, until I knew they were going to make repairs, I didn't know anything was wrong with it. And I think most of the people noticeable was if you look down the bottom edge of the roof, you could see that between the supports, sometimes it drooped a little bit. I think the biggest droop was a total of 11 inches between spans, which, as long as the spans are, that didn't seem like a lot. And it's, it was a 1832 covered bridge, and I expected it to sag a little bit. Mm-hmm. But during an inspection, they found there was some rotten wood inside where, people couldn't see it. And the more they dug into it, the more they found. So the repairs became necessary. But I don't know if you were aware they considered completely taking out the bridge, and the Department of Transportation presented to the town 3 options, the cheapest of which was $16.5 million, which would have connected about where the west end of this bridge does, and then wrapped around the back of the town hall. But the guy said, who presented it, realistically, while I'm telling you 16 million, by the time it's designed and built, it's going to be 20 million. So I'm really glad that they were able to get that funding and repair this when it wouldn't be there today.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a big testament to the town of Bath, because so many of those covered bridges have been lost. Because
we're
it's hard.
Fortunate to get some significant government funding for that. We got a grant that took care of just about everything. Mm-hmm. So we're very fortunate.
Very, very fortunate. So the bridge was closed for 21 months, which is a long time. And I'm assuming that the next way to cross the river, how far away do you have to drive to cross the river?
Yeah, I can actually see your window, but I would have to drive to Woodsville on back roads and then come back around for a total of 11 miles to travel what I could do in 300 yards if the bridge was open. And from the time that they began on it, they wouldn't let me or anyone else walk across, and they wouldn't let me sign off anything or get my own hard hat. There was no way they were going to let me go across. So I tried, while the gallery's only open for 6 months a year, but I tried an inflatable raft below the waterfall, and for a couple different reasons, that made me look pretty ridiculous in both cases. That didn't work. So whenever there wasn't too high a water or a threatening storm, I swam across and just kept dry clothes and a towel in the gallery, and then swam back with my keys in a zipped up baggie clenched in my teeth, treading water across to get back home.
That's the best story ever. Were you the only person doing that?
Yeah. And I was surprised there were people. It just seemed logical to me that I didn't want to drive. That's 22 miles a day getting there and back. And but people, I remember there was a guy I saw in the post office that said, "You aren't swimming across, are you?" And I said, "Yeah, when I can." He said, "No, you're not swimming across." So the next time, he was always there at the same time I came in. So the next day I came in and I was still dripping wet, and he believed me then.
That's the best story. I love the image of you with the baggie with your keys in your mouth swimming across the river. Well, I guess that makes sense. It's better than driving 22 miles, no doubt about it.
Yeah, there was one time I swam across and it was fine. Coming back, I was swimming a little faster because there was thunder all around. So yeah, that one I made it a little quicker.
Yikes. Yeah, I would imagine. You were a huge part of the rededication ceremony, which was on August 14th in 2014. Can you tell us about what that day was like? What did it look like?
Well, I was there was kind of a citizen component to the bridge committee, and I represented the historical society. So I was in on most of their meetings. And at one of those meetings, they said, when it's reopening, we want the town clerk, Bev Woods, to be the first one to go across. She was a town clerk here for 31 years, and she lived right at the end. She's the first house at the west end, and the town hall is just a straight shot through the bridge, and from the other end, maybe 75 yards. So she couldn't get to work at that point either. And it's a really strange coincidence that Bev just died last week, and her funeral was today, as a matter of fact.
Oh, no.
Anyway, they wanted her to be the first one to go through, and I immediately volunteered my car. I've got a 1964 convertible Corvair, and I said, let's put her sitting up on the back seat, and I'll drive her through, which they all agreed to. And I have to admit, there is a component of me knowing, okay, if I'm driving her through, actually, I get to be the first one through the bridge after all this time. So
That's right.
yeah. So I didn't tell her. You're the first one I've told that. But so yeah, she climbed in and sat up on the back, and we drove through really slow and honking all the way, and people applauding at the other end, and then the Historical Society wanted me to give an address at the end of the bridge right after that, which I did. So that was my part of the reopening.
That's great. And that address, part of it was featured in a newspaper article that I had access to. And I wondered if you might read that address to us.
I would be happy
Great.
to. And here again, you may need to edit, but had you been one of the original 1765 residents of Bath, you would have had to ride a canoe or boat or swim across here. Later, a ferry here or close by could have carried you across. Then in 1794, while George Washington was in his first term as president, a bridge was built in this spot. It would have been considerably closer to the water and was done at a cost of $366.66. It was taken out by a flood. It was replaced in 1806 at a cost of $1,000 when Jefferson was in the White House. Another built in its place in 1820. In 1824, a huge fire destroyed this entire block from here, being the brick store, south to the town parking lot. And I should tell you here, you can kind of, for anybody that's listening, you can kind of imagine the downtown Bath, if you can call it that, is kind of an L shape. So this fire in 1824 destroyed virtually all of the vertical part of that L. And people between the vertical and the horizontal, people drive through a gap that's between the vertical and horizontal to get through the bridge. Mm-hmm. So, the bridge was spared because the wind was blowing the other way. But the very next day, it was taken out by another flood. So it was a pretty bad day for Bath, New Hampshire, that 24-hour period. But yet another was built that same year, and it burned later. Finally, in 1832, for $2,900 and under the direction of a local carpenter named George Wetherill, this bridge was erected. And what he and his men built was, according to James Garvin of the New Hampshire Division of Historical Resources, a feat of nearly superhuman craftsmanship. Considering the massive stones of the piers, with only levers, hands, backs, horses, and oxen, they were laid in place. Huge arches, laminated and hand-planed so smooth that they seemed machine-made. Channels had to be cut through those to accommodate other timbers, which needed to line up just right with other supports and piers. Wooden pins called trunnels or tree nails, each formed by hand. More than 180 large trees had to be felled just for the deck beams, all done with axes and two-man saws. This bridge, by the way, is 396 feet, so it's very, very long. What they did here, with some maintenance, has stood against heavy floods, heavy loads, ice outs, hurricanes, and fire for now 190 years. Once completed, the bridge became a parking spot for horses and buggies in bad weather for those doing business in town or going to church. But bored horses like to chew on wood. This is called cribbing, and it began to happen a lot in the bridge. So much so that by the mid-1840s, the town selectmen made an ordinance to no longer allow the parking of livestock in the bridge. There's still evidence of that cribbing on some of the posts inside today. The signs posted at either end warning of a fine if one took their team across faster than a walk was not a speed limit. The belief at the time was that the vibration made by the pounding of horses' hooves would eventually destroy the structural integrity of the bridge. The same was thought for soldiers marching in step. Before crossing, they would always break stride as recently as the Second World War. On July 4th, 1853, the first steam train rolled under the bridge on the western end and into the Bath depot. But first, the entire bridge had to be raised to accommodate those trains. Also in the mid-19th century, circuses would regularly come to town in a parade of brightly colored horses pulling painted wagons full of exotic animals over River Road and then across the bridge. One of these times, an elephant named Hannibal refused to enter the far portal no matter how much he was coerced. Finally, he was led down to the river's edge, where he waded and swam across and on up to High Street, where the circuses were held. This, by the way, is the exact spot that I would swim across to get to work. The bridge might well have been lost to another fire had the wind direction been different one cold night in February of 1872. A fire started in a small dwelling here in the side yard of the church and soon raged out of control, destroying the entire block on this side from here to the town garage. Like most covered bridges, this one was known as a kissing bridge, as it provided shelter from curious eyes. It could also be a pretty scary place on a dark night. Though it was lit at the time with kerosene lanterns, it could have been a long, dim trip through in those days. At least one young lady was particularly terrified as she returned home with her date in a wagon. It seems her brother climbed up and hid above in the beams until she was just underneath with her boyfriend when he jumped down into the back of the wagon with a holler. All through the 19th and even the 20th century, a man was chosen to be paid to be the snow warden. This meant it was his responsibility to keep a layer of snow on the deck of the bridge to ensure that sleighs and sleds could travel across. You can imagine what a chore that would be with a bridge this long. In 1897, more stones were added to the piers, giving them the bow front shape that they now have to better break up ice coming downstream. Actually, they were called heaters because the shape is so similar to irons for ironing clothes, which were themselves called heaters at the time. By 1920, trains were getting bigger and the bridge had to be raised yet again. And at this time, the supplemental arches were added for more support. Log drives were common in the old days here, and on one occasion, a mass of timber became tangled between the piers and the shore. A young man with a peavey scaled down and climbed out among them, loosening them. But suddenly he was caught among tons of tumbling timber. He was able miraculously to jump, ride, and surf the trees over the waterfall, and he made it to shore safely below. At the end of the Civil War, and every war since, men have returned to their homes through this bridge. Farmers have taken hay wagons, milk wagons, produce and products, and every kind of livestock through this bridge to markets or fairs. Expectant mothers have rushed across. Children have run through to school or to the candy counter at the brick store. Young and not so young lovers have strolled through, and some have gone to their final rest through this bridge for 190 years. Bare feet, horses, buggies, wagons, and vehicles from early horseless carriages to modern cars have driven through. And that pretty much brings us to today and what we're doing here. I hope you'll keep a few things in mind as you pass over it in the future. One, this bridge is a part of the fabric of this town. It's extremely well built and historic, and with tourism, it's part of the town's future success. Number two, we should never take it for granted. Three, if you live on the other side and have changed your routine as a result of its closure, we hope you'll come back this way and stop in for coffee and a donut at the brick store or stroll across for an ice cream at the Hop. This bridge has been carefully and wonderfully rebuilt by a crew who took pride in their work, who came to work for 10 hours a day, 4 days a week, and did it through one of the coldest and hardest winters anyone around here can remember. And they were virtually exposed to the elements over a river near the spray of a waterfall. They deserve our appreciation, respect, and applause. If anything I've said here may have convinced you that history maybe isn't so dull after all, please consider joining the Historical Society. Thank you.
That's fantastic. That should be
Thank you.
printed and posted on the bridge so everybody can read it.
Oh, well,
It's
thank you.
amazing.
Maybe I'll
It's amazing.
suggest that.
It's amazing. I especially love that you said the bridge is part of the town's fabric, and I think that that's key. And that's what led me into wanting to learn more about these covered bridges, because they're not just, they're not just bridges. They're a lot more than that, and they mean a lot to people.
Yep, they certainly do to me and my wife, and I think especially the people that live close by. We kind of consider ourselves guardians.
Mm-hmm.
It was 2 or 3 nights ago, my wife saw flashing lights and saw that an alarm was on in the bridge. So we called 911 to make sure everything was okay, and it turns out it was. But yeah, the local people are especially cautious and careful of it. And if you don't mind another story,
Not at all.
there is an annual music fest in Bath that is Jerry Jam. It's kind of a tribute to Jerry Garcia.
Mm-hmm.
Those people come from all over and drive through the bridge to get to where this event is. A lot of them ignore the sign that says one vehicle at a time, and the residents get really angry. And my wife has been seen and heard yelling at traffic to stop and flailing her arms to coerce them to stop. And I asked the chief of police one time, could I just get a permit to shoot the tires out of the first car that goes through just to make an example? And he said, he laughed and he said, Craig, you don't need a permit.
That's the best story. So whenever your Jerry Fest is, or anyone listening going to Jerry Fest, watch out.
Yeah, there you go.
That's great. So, and I understand that you have pieces of the old covered bridge in your art studio. How did you end up with that?
Well, there's in my home studio, I've got more. I've got trunnels from this one, and to better explain that, a trunnel, as I mentioned in that statement, is an intentional mispronunciation, I guess, of tree nail, and it's like a wooden pin that's maybe 1.5 inches thick, but on one end it's bigger, like a nail. It's not sharp on the other, but there would be 2 holes drilled through 2 pieces of wood in the bridge, and this would be pounded through and long enough that it would go through, but not all the way through because of that bigger nail head, so to speak. But they would split the other end and then drive a wedge in it, which would kind of splay out that end. So it was never going to go either direction. And it would shrink and expand with the bridge and weather conditions. Of course, it's never going to rust. Mm-hmm. So they were very dependable. And they took 2,100 of those out of the bridge during that repair. The Historical Society was supposed to get them all, and we got about 3 buckets full was all.
Oh, wow.
They threw the rest of the way, and I was dumpster diving several times and rescuing a bunch of them. And so I've got a couple of those not only in my studio put into some hand-hewn beams, but also in the gallery to show people that when they come in and they're asking about the bridge, I can show them those. In the studio at home, I not only have 2 of those, but one of our other covered bridges, the oldest in America, the Bath Haverhill Bridge. Shortly after we moved here, they were re-siding that and taking the old red siding off and some of the white trim, and it was just in a big pile. And I called the selectman and I said, could I come pick up some of that? And believe it or not, they told me, you'll save us a trip to the dump if you do.
Wow.
So I went and loaded as much of it as would fit into my van as possible, and had no idea what I would do with it, but it was just too valuable to me. I mean, that bridge goes back to 1827 or 29, depending on who you believe. And I'm sure the siding isn't that old, but still. So now that is the entire knee wall around my home studio is made of that old redwood, and some has initials carved in it, and some of the trim there I used for trim.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm glad that you knew how treasured that wood was. It's amazing how things just get thrown away.
Yeah, I can't. It hurts to imagine that they would just throw it in the dump and let it rot.
Well, I was going to ask you because Bath is home to 3 covered bridges, and I know that the Bath Bridge is your favorite, but it sounds like you still care for the other 2 as well.
Yeah. The newest one's 1849. It's over the local swimming hole, so that one is a favorite. I like them all, but the oldest, unfortunately, is not. There's a newer bridge that runs right parallel to it, so it's kind of hard to get a good view of that to get back away from it enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is.
And you can only walk through that one. You can't
Right.
drive through that anymore.
Right. So, looking at your artwork, how many times do you think you've painted the Bath Bridge?
Well, I started out when we got here in 2002 painting it a lot, and I quit counting at 35, and that has to be 15 to 18 years ago, and I'm still painting it. So it's over 50 times, I'm sure, just
Wow.
this one.
That's amazing. And that's kind of a double-edged question, because didn't you literally paint the portals as well
Yeah.
of the bridge?
Yeah, that was somewhat selfish too. I thought it used to be red. I've got a picture of it when it was red from, I think the picture was taken in 1960 and it was faded, but it's still obviously red. But I thought this would look a lot better, and I think it might help the town tourism more if it had red, white trim and kind of barn red. So I asked the town if I could do that, and they bought the paint, and so I painted both ends of it. But also, like I say, selfishly, when I painted pictures of it, I wanted that end to be red just for the sake of a better painting.
Absolutely. Well, it's not the only red bridge in town, so
Right, yeah.
that's okay. That's great. Well, thank you for talking with me today.
Well, thanks for asking.
But before we go, can you tell our listeners about your art studio, when you're open, how they can see you? Maybe they can come in and ask for their own guided tour of the bridge.
Okay. We are at 17 Lisbon Road. If you drive into the town common, like I say, there's only 3 businesses. And unfortunately, the other 2 are closed right now because of COVID and the brick stores for sale.
Oh.
And they are my landlords. So my business actually is for sale too. But I am still in there every day. Well, 5 days a week painting. Wednesday through Sunday, I'm generally there from 10 to 3, sometimes later. If people call, they could set up an appointment. And once the fall comes, I'll be in there about 7 days a week most of the time. And then it'll be from 9 to about 5. And I'd be glad to have company with the brick store and the ice cream shop being closed. It's a little more lonely in town.
I bet.
This year.
I bet. Great. Well, thank you again for talking to me, and thank you for caring for the Bath Bridge. It's a state treasure, and we're lucky that you care for it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Covered Bridges of New Hampshire is created by me and recorded in Hancock, New Hampshire. The song Old New Hampshire was arranged and performed by Josh Black. The introduction is courtesy of Greg Kretschmar. This podcast is a companion to my book, Covered Bridges of New Hampshire. You can find out more about the book, the podcast, blog posts, upcoming events, and an interactive covered bridge map at coveredbridgesnh.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Covered Bridges of New Hampshire. Please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Kim Chandler. Thanks for listening.